Imagine being given one choice. Not money, not power, not success, but anything. And instead of choosing what everyone else would choose, you ask for something invisible, something no one can see, but everyone will feel. This is the story of Solomon, a king who became the wisest man to ever live. But here's the part that no one talks about. His wisdom didn't just make him powerful. It led him to a decision so shocking that it revealed the truth in a way that no one expected. A decision involving a child, a test, and a moment that would silence an entire kingdom. And yet, that same wisdom would later lead to something far more dangerous, because the smartest man in history still made one mistake. That changed everything. Solomon did not begin his life as a legend. He began as a young man placed in a position most people would not be prepared for. When his father, David, passed on the throne, Solomon inherited not only a kingdom, but also the weight of everything that had been built before him. David had spent years establishing stability, fighting battles, and securing the future of Israel. By the time Solomon stepped into power, the kingdom was strong, but it was also fragile in ways that were not immediately visible. Maintaining something is often harder than building it, and Solomon understood that from the very beginning. He was not known for strength like his father. He had not earned his place through war or conquest. Instead, he found himself surrounded by experienced leaders, advisors, and expectations that seemed far beyond his years. Every decision he would make carried consequences, and there was no room for hesitation. A single mistake at that level could create unrest, weaken trust, or undo years of progress. The reality of leadership settled in quickly, and with it came a quiet awareness that he did not yet have what was required to lead effectively. Unlike many rulers, Solomon did not pretend to have all the answers. There was no illusion of complete confidence, no attempt to mask uncertainty with authority. Instead, there was a growing recognition that wisdom, the ability to judge correctly, to understand people, to see beyond the surface, was something he lacked, and without it, everything else would eventually fail. Wealth could not solve complex human problems. Power could enforce decisions, but it could not guarantee they were right. Even loyalty from others depended on the consistency and fairness of his judgment. This awareness created a kind of internal pressure. It was not loud or visible, but it shaped how he thought about his role. He began to understand that ruling a kingdom was less about control and more about clarity. Every dispute, every conflict, every request for judgment would require more than quick decisions. It would require insight. And insight was not something that could be forced or improvised. It had to be developed or given. It was during this early period of his reign, when uncertainty was still present and the future remained undefined, that something unusual happened. One night, Solomon had a dream. Dreams were not uncommon, but this one was different. It was clear, structured, and carried a sense of presence that did not feel like imagination. In this dream, God spoke to him, not with instructions, not with warnings, but with an offer. He was told to ask for whatever he wanted. The simplicity of the offer made it more significant. There were no limits placed on what he could choose, no conditions that narrowed the decision. It was a moment of complete freedom, something few people ever experience. In that moment, Solomon had access to anything: wealth, long life, victory over enemies, power beyond measure. Everything that most rulers would desire was available to him, and all he had to do was choose. What makes this moment important is not just the opportunity itself, but the mindset Solomon brought into it. He did not approach it with greed or impulse. Instead, he considered his position, his responsibilities, and his limitations. He understood that whatever he asked for would define the kind of king he would become. This was not simply about personal gain. It was about shaping the future of an entire nation. And so, instead of asking for wealth or power, Solomon made a different request. He asked for wisdom, the ability to discern between right and wrong, to judge fairly, and to lead with understanding. It was not a visible gift. It would not immediately change how people saw him, but it would affect every decision he made from that point forward. This choice set him apart. It revealed a level of self-awareness that was uncommon, especially for someone in his position. He recognized that the most valuable thing he could have was not control over circumstances, but clarity in how to respond to them. And in choosing wisdom, he prioritized long-term stability over immediate advantage. According to the account, this request was met with approval. Because Solomon did not ask for personal gain, he was granted not only wisdom, but also the things he did not request: wealth, honor, and influence. However, it was the wisdom that would define his legacy. It became the foundation of his decisions, the reason people began to recognize something different about him. At this point, nothing dramatic had happened yet. There were no famous judgments, no stories that spread across nations, but something had changed internally. Solomon was no longer just a young king trying to manage a kingdom. He now had the capacity to approach problems in a way that others could not. The real impact of that would only become clear over time. And it would not take long before that wisdom was tested. After receiving what he had asked for, Solomon did not suddenly change in appearance or position. There was no immediate sign to the people around him that anything had happened at all. He still sat on the same throne, spoke to the same advisors, and ruled the same kingdom. But internally, something had shifted. The difference was subtle at first, less about what he did and more about how he saw things. Situations that once felt uncertain began to carry patterns. People's words no longer stood alone. They revealed intention, emotion, and sometimes deception. It was not that problems disappeared. It was that he could now understand them more clearly. In the early days of his reign, people watched closely. A new king always brings uncertainty, and many were waiting to see whether Solomon would prove capable or fall short of expectations. Leaders, elders, and citizens alike needed reassurance, not through promises, but through action. And sooner than expected, a situation arose that would test exactly what Solomon had asked for. Two women came before the king. They lived in the same house and both had recently given birth. There were no witnesses, no family members present, and no external way to verify their claims. One of the children had died during the night, and now both women stood before Solomon, each insisting that the living child was hers. It was not just a disagreement, it was a direct conflict with no clear evidence. Cases like this are difficult even with modern systems. Without proof, decisions often rely on testimony, and testimony can be unreliable when emotion is involved. In this situation, both women spoke with certainty. Each told a story that placed the truth on her side and accused the other of deception. The more they spoke, the less clarity there seemed to be. To anyone listening, it would have sounded like an impossible case to resolve. The court was silent as the argument continued. There was no document to examine, no witness to question, and no physical evidence that could settle the matter. It was one word against another, and both sides appeared equally convincing. The responsibility of judgment fell entirely on Solomon, and whatever he decided would not only affect the child's life, but also establish his credibility as king. Solomon listened carefully. He did not interrupt immediately or rush toward a conclusion. Instead, he allowed both women to speak, observing not just their words but how they spoke them. Tone, urgency, and consistency, all of it mattered. But even with careful listening, the situation remained unclear. There was no direct path to the truth through conventional means. This is where the nature of wisdom began to reveal itself. Wisdom is not simply knowledge or intelligence. It is the ability to approach a problem from a perspective others do not consider. Where most would try to force a decision based on incomplete information, Solomon chose a different approach. He understood that while facts were unavailable, human nature was not. And sometimes, the truth is not revealed through evidence, but through reaction. After a moment of silence, Solomon gave an order that seemed, at first, completely unreasonable. He instructed that a sword be brought forward. The request alone changed the atmosphere in the room. What had been a dispute suddenly felt more serious, more final. Then he made a statement that shocked everyone present. He said that the living child should be divided into two parts, with each woman receiving half. The reaction was immediate, but not the same from both sides. One woman accepted the decision without resistance. She did not argue, did not protest, and did not attempt to stop what was about to happen. The other woman reacted differently. She stepped forward quickly, her response driven by urgency rather than calculation. She begged the king to give the child to the other woman instead. She was willing to give up her claim entirely if it meant the child would live. That difference in response revealed everything. Solomon did not need further explanation. The true mother had shown herself, not through words but through instinct. Her willingness to sacrifice her own claim in order to protect the child exposed the truth more clearly than any evidence could have. The other woman, who accepted the division, revealed a lack of that same instinct. In that moment, the case that had seemed impossible became clear. Solomon immediately reversed the order. He commanded that the child be given to the woman who had asked for its life to be spared. There was no hesitation in his decision. What had appeared to be a harsh and illogical judgment was, in reality, a calculated method to expose the truth. The courtroom shifted from confusion to clarity. What had just taken place was not only a resolution of a dispute, it was a demonstration of something far more significant. People began to understand that Solomon's decisions would not follow predictable patterns. He did not rely solely on rules or appearances. He understood behavior, motivation, and the deeper aspects of human nature. News of this judgment spread quickly. It moved beyond the courtroom, beyond the city, and eventually throughout the kingdom. People spoke about what they had witnessed, not just the outcome, but the process. The idea that a king could resolve such a complex situation without evidence created a new kind of confidence in his leadership. For the first time, Solomon was not just seen as a ruler by position, but as a ruler by capability. His wisdom was no longer an internal gift. It had become visible, and with that visibility came something powerful: trust. But moments like this do more than build reputation. They set expectations. Now that Solomon had demonstrated this level of insight, people would expect it again. Every future decision would be measured against this standard. The bar had been raised, and maintaining it would not be easy. At the same time, something else began to develop. As more people heard about his judgment, they became curious, not just about his decisions, but about how he thought. Wisdom, when it becomes visible, attracts attention, and attention, when it grows, begins to extend beyond borders. What started as a single case between two women had now become a defining moment. It marked the beginning of Solomon's reputation as the wisest man of his time, but it also set in motion a larger shift, one that would bring him influence, recognition, and opportunities that extended far beyond his own kingdom. And as that influence grew, so did the complexity of the choices he would have to make. The judgment between the two women did more than resolve a dispute. It changed how Solomon was perceived across his entire kingdom. What people had witnessed was not just intelligence, but a kind of understanding that went beyond normal reasoning. It was the ability to see through confusion and reach clarity where none seemed possible. And once that kind of ability is demonstrated, it does not remain contained. It spreads. Word of Solomon's decision traveled quickly. It moved through marketplaces, into homes, across regions, and eventually beyond the borders of Israel. People repeated the story, sometimes adding their own interpretation, but always with the same conclusion. This king was different. He was not relying on force or authority alone. He was ruling with insight. As his reputation grew, so did the expectations placed upon him. People began bringing more complex matters before him, disputes that others could not resolve, questions that required more than simple answers, and decisions that demanded balance rather than control. Each case added to his credibility, reinforcing the idea that his wisdom was consistent, not accidental. At the same time, Solomon's role as king expanded beyond judgment. Leadership is not limited to solving disputes. It also involves building, organizing, and sustaining a system that can function over time. Solomon began focusing on strengthening the structure of the kingdom, administration, alliances, trade, and stability. These were not dramatic changes, but they were necessary ones. A kingdom that is well managed does not draw attention for its problems. It becomes known for its order. One of the most significant developments during this period was the expansion of trade and diplomacy. Solomon established connections with neighboring regions, creating pathways for resources, knowledge, and influence to move in and out of his kingdom. These relationships were not built on force but on mutual benefit. Trade routes opened, goods flowed, and the kingdom became increasingly prosperous. With prosperity came visibility. Other nations began to take notice, not only of Israel's wealth but of the leadership behind it. Solomon's name started to carry weight beyond his own territory. He was no longer just a local ruler. He was becoming a figure of interest on a much larger scale. This attention reached individuals of influence, including rulers who had their own power and stability. Among them was the Queen of Sheba, a leader known for her own intelligence and resources. She had heard about Solomon, not just about his wealth, but about his wisdom. Stories of his ability to answer difficult questions and resolve complex matters had reached her, and she chose to see it for herself. Her visit was not casual. It was intentional, structured, and meant to test what she had heard. When she arrived, she brought with her questions, difficult ones, layered ones, the kind that cannot be answered with simple responses. This was not a conversation, it was an evaluation. Solomon received her without hesitation. He did not avoid the questions or simplify them. Instead, he engaged with each one, responding in a way that demonstrated not just knowledge, but understanding. He addressed the core of each issue, revealing patterns and insights that made the answers clear. According to the account, there was nothing she asked that he could not explain. This was not because he had memorized information or prepared for the moment. It was because his approach to thinking allowed him to navigate complexity without losing clarity. The result of this interaction was significant. The Queen of Sheba recognized that what she had heard was not exaggerated. In fact, it was understated. Solomon's wisdom exceeded expectations, and his kingdom reflected that. Its organization, its stability, and its prosperity were all connected to the way he ruled. Her acknowledgement added another layer to Solomon's reputation. It was one thing for his own people to trust him. It was another for an external ruler to confirm his capability. This validation extended his influence even further, reinforcing his position not just as a king, but as a reference point for wisdom. As time passed, Solomon's reign reached a level of success that was difficult to match. The kingdom experienced peace, stability, and growth. Resources were abundant, trade was active, and internal conflict was minimized. From the outside, it appeared that everything was functioning exactly as it should. However, success at that level introduces a different kind of challenge. When problems are reduced and systems are stable, attention shifts. The urgency that once drove careful decision-making begins to fade. There is more room for comfort, more opportunity for expansion, and more choices that are not strictly necessary but still possible. This is where the nature of wisdom becomes more complex. It is one thing to apply wisdom under pressure, when the consequences of mistakes are immediate and visible. It is another to maintain that same level of discipline when conditions are favorable, when success creates a sense of security. Solomon's earlier decisions had been shaped by awareness, an understanding of what he lacked and what was at stake. But as his position strengthened, the environment around him changed. There was less resistance, fewer immediate threats, and more freedom to act without consequence. And that freedom, while valuable, also carried risk. because not every decision made in a position of strength is necessary. Some are driven by curiosity, others by desire, and some by a gradual shift in priorities. These decisions may not appear harmful at first, but over time, they can alter direction in ways that are difficult to reverse. At this stage in Solomon's life, nothing had gone wrong yet. The kingdom was stable, his reputation was strong, and his influence continued to grow. But the conditions that would later lead to his most significant mistake were beginning to form, not through a single event, but through a gradual change in context. And those changes would not be obvious immediately. As the years passed, the reign of Solomon entered a phase that many would describe as its peak. The kingdom was no longer in a fragile state. It was established, organized, and functioning with a level of consistency that reduced the need for constant intervention. Disputes still existed, but they were fewer and often resolved more efficiently. Trade continued to expand, alliances remained stable, and internally there was a sense of order that had not always been present in earlier generations. With stability came the ability to focus on long-term projects, things that required planning, resources, and time. One of the most significant of these was the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem. This was not just an architectural project, it was symbolic. It represented continuity, identity, and the central place of worship for the people. The planning, materials, and labor required for such a structure were extensive, and the process itself demonstrated the level of organization the kingdom had achieved under Solomon's leadership. The temple became a reflection of both devotion and capability. It showed that the kingdom had moved beyond survival and into a stage where it could create something lasting. For Solomon, this was not just about completing a project. It was about reinforcing a foundation that would outlast his reign. The attention to detail, the coordination required, and the scale of the effort all pointed to a system that was functioning at a high level. At the same time, Solomon undertook other building projects, palaces, administrative centers, and infrastructure that supported the growing needs of the kingdom. These developments improved efficiency and strengthened control over different regions. They also required significant resources, which were made available through the continued success of trade and alliances. Externally, relationships with neighboring regions remained active. These connections were not limited to trade. They also involved diplomacy and, in some cases, strategic partnerships. Such arrangements often came with expectations and obligations. Maintaining them required careful balance, ensuring that cooperation did not turn into dependence, and that influence did not compromise independence. During this period, Solomon's decisions appeared consistent with his earlier approach. He continued to manage complex situations with clarity, and there was little indication of instability. From an outside perspective, his reign could be seen as a model of effective leadership, combining wisdom, organization, and growth. However, beneath this stability, subtle shifts were taking place. They were not dramatic or immediately visible, but they were present. As responsibilities became more manageable and systems more reliable, the intensity of decision-making began to change. There was less urgency, fewer immediate threats, and more room to act without pressure. This shift affected the nature of choices being made. Earlier in his reign, decisions were often reactive, responding to problems, resolving disputes, maintaining order. Now many decisions were proactive, expanding influence, increasing resources, strengthening connections. While this transition is natural in a stable system, it also introduces a different kind of risk. Not every opportunity needs to be pursued. Not every expansion is necessary, and not every alliance is without consequence. One area where this became increasingly relevant was in the formation of political relationships through marriage. In the context of the time, such arrangements were common. They served as a way to secure alliances, reduce conflict, and establish connections between different regions. Each marriage represented a link, an agreement that extended beyond personal relationships into political strategy. Over time, the number of these relationships increased. Individually, each decision could be justified as a practical step toward stability or cooperation. Collectively, however, they began to create a network of influences that extended into the core of Solomon's environment. This is where the nature of influence becomes important. Influence does not always appear as pressure or opposition. It can be gradual, subtle, and integrated into daily life. It can shape preferences, introduce new perspectives, and slowly adjust priorities. When multiple influences converge, their combined effect can be significant, even if each one seems minor on its own. At this stage, there was no immediate disruption. The kingdom remained stable, the systems continued to function, and Solomon's reputation was intact. But the environment around him was no longer as controlled as it had been earlier. It had become more complex, more interconnected, and more susceptible to gradual change. Wisdom, as demonstrated in earlier decisions, relies on clarity, on the ability to see situations as they are and respond accordingly. Maintaining that clarity becomes more difficult when multiple factors are introduced, especially when they are not directly related to immediate problems. Solomon's earlier awareness, his recognition of what he needed in order to lead, had been a key factor in his success. But awareness requires consistency. It must be maintained, not just in moments of challenge, but in periods of stability as well. And this is where the next phase of his story begins to take shape. Not through a single event, but through a series of decisions that did not seem significant at the time. As Solomon continued to expand his influence, the changes around him became less about immediate outcomes and more about long-term direction. The kingdom was still functioning efficiently, and from the outside, very little appeared to be wrong. Trade remained strong, the infrastructure was intact, and there were no major internal conflicts threatening stability. In many ways, this was the kind of environment every ruler aimed to achieve. But stability can create a false sense of control. When systems are working well, it becomes easier to assume they will continue to do so without constant attention. Decisions begin to feel less critical, and the consequences of small changes are not always immediately visible. This is where subtle shifts can take place, gradual enough to go unnoticed, but consistent enough to alter direction over time. One of the most significant factors during this period was the continued development of alliances through marriage. Each relationship connected Solomon to another region, another group of people, and another set of expectations. These were not random decisions. They were strategic, designed to maintain peace and expand influence. However, strategy does not eliminate consequence, it only delays it. With each new connection came new ideas, new customs, and new forms of influence. These influences did not arrive as direct challenges to Solomon's authority. Instead, they integrated into his environment quietly. Over time, they became part of the structure of his daily life. What had once been a clear and focused approach to leadership began to encounter competing perspectives. This is how change often happens, not through sudden disruption, but through accumulation. A single decision may have little effect, but repeated over time, similar decisions can reshape priorities without immediate awareness. The environment becomes more complex, and maintaining clarity requires more effort than before. At the same time, Solomon's position continued to reinforce his sense of capability. His earlier successes had demonstrated that his decisions could lead to positive outcomes. That confidence, while justified, also carried a risk. When past decisions have consistently worked, it becomes easier to trust future decisions without the same level of scrutiny. This does not mean that Solomon abandoned wisdom. Rather, the context in which he applied it had changed. Earlier in his reign, wisdom was used to solve clear problems. Now, it was being applied in situations where the boundaries were less defined. The questions were no longer about right and wrong in a direct sense, but about balance, influence, and long-term impact. During this time, the structure of the kingdom itself began to reflect these changes. The expansion of projects, the maintenance of alliances, and the management of resources required ongoing coordination. This created a system that depended not only on Solomon's decisions, but also on the consistency of those decisions over time. And consistency becomes more difficult when the number of variables increases. There is a point in any system where growth introduces complexity faster than it introduces control. When that point is reached, maintaining direction requires deliberate effort. Without that effort, the system does not collapse immediately. It drifts. This drift is not obvious. It does not appear as a mistake or a failure. It appears as a gradual shift in focus, a series of decisions that make sense individually but begin to move away from the original foundation. For Solomon, the foundation had been clear at the beginning. He had recognized his limitations and asked for wisdom to lead effectively. That choice had shaped his early decisions and established the stability of the kingdom. But as conditions changed, maintaining that same level of focus required ongoing awareness. And this is where the difference between having wisdom and applying it consistently becomes significant. Wisdom can guide decisions, but it does not remove the need for discipline. It does not prevent influence, and it does not eliminate the possibility of error. It provides the ability to choose correctly, but only if that ability is actively used. As Solomon's environment became more complex, the demands on his attention increased. There were more relationships to manage, more expectations to meet, and more opportunities to consider. Each of these required judgment, but not all of them required the same level of caution. Some decisions, particularly those related to alliances and expansion, began to carry implications that were not immediately addressed. They were not urgent, and therefore they were not prioritized in the same way as earlier challenges. Over time, this allowed certain patterns to develop without direct correction. From the outside, nothing had changed dramatically. The kingdom was still strong. Solomon was still respected. His reputation for wisdom remained intact, but internally the conditions were shifting. And those shifts were setting the stage for something that would not be visible until much later. Because not all consequences appear immediately. Some take time to form. And when they do, they often trace back to decisions that once seemed harmless. As the reign of Solomon continued, the patterns that had been forming quietly in the background began to settle into something more permanent. There was no single moment where everything changed. Instead, the shift was gradual, so gradual that it did not interrupt the normal functioning of the kingdom. From a distance, nothing appeared out of place. But internally, the foundation that once guided his decisions was no longer as central as it had been at the beginning. One of the most significant changes during this period was not in policy or structure, but in influence. The alliances Solomon had built over time had expanded beyond political agreements. They had become part of his daily environment. Each relationship brought with it different beliefs, practices, and priorities. Individually, these influences did not appear strong enough to alter direction, but collectively, they created a new context, one that was more complex and less defined than before. This is where the nature of influence becomes critical. Influence does not always operate through force or pressure. It often works through familiarity. The more something is present, the more normal it becomes. What was once external begins to feel internal. What was once observed becomes accepted. And over time, the line between original intention and new direction becomes less clear. For Solomon, this process did not happen suddenly. It developed over years. Decisions that once would have been examined carefully began to feel routine. The need to question every choice diminished, not because the decisions were unimportant, but because the environment had become stable enough to allow for flexibility. And flexibility, while useful, can also lead to inconsistency if it is not managed carefully. At the same time, Solomon's earlier success continued to reinforce his confidence. His kingdom remained prosperous. Trade routes were active, resources were abundant, and there were no immediate threats to his authority. These conditions created a sense of continuity, a belief that the system was strong enough to sustain itself. But systems do not sustain themselves automatically. They depend on the consistency of the principles that built them. This is where a subtle but important shift occurred. The clarity that had once defined Solomon's approach began to compete with new variables, new influences, new priorities, and new forms of reasoning. These variables did not replace his wisdom, but they began to interact with it in ways that made decisions less straightforward. In earlier situations, Solomon had relied on his ability to understand human nature, to see beyond surface-level arguments and identify the underlying truth. That approach worked because the problems were contained and the context was controlled. Now, the context itself had expanded. The decisions were no longer isolated. They were interconnected, influenced by relationships that extended beyond the immediate situation. As a result, some choices began to reflect compromise rather than clarity, not in a way that was immediately harmful, but in a way that introduced gradual deviation from the original foundation. These compromises were not made under pressure or necessity. They were made within a stable environment where the consequences were not immediately visible. Over time, this created a difference between intention and outcome. Solomon may have continued to believe that his decisions were aligned with his earlier values, but the accumulation of small changes began to alter the overall direction. This is how complex systems evolve, not through single events, but through consistent adjustments that eventually lead to a new state. Another factor during this period was the expansion of Solomon's projects and responsibilities. Managing a growing kingdom required coordination across multiple levels: administration, trade, construction, and diplomacy. Each of these areas demanded attention, and as they grew, they required delegation and trust in others. Delegation introduces another layer of complexity. When responsibilities are distributed, outcomes depend not only on the leader's decisions but also on the actions of those carrying them out. Maintaining alignment across such a system requires constant reinforcement of principles. Without that reinforcement, variation begins to appear. In Solomon's case, the system remained effective, but the alignment became less precise. The core values that had guided his early decisions were still present, but they were no longer the sole reference point. Other considerations, political, relational, and practical, began to share that role. From a functional perspective, the kingdom continued to operate successfully. There were no immediate failures, no visible breakdowns. But from a structural perspective, the foundation was no longer as concentrated as it had been. This difference is important. A system can appear stable while its foundation is gradually shifting. The effects of that shift do not appear immediately, but they accumulate. And when they reach a certain point, they begin to influence outcomes in ways that are difficult to trace back to a single cause. At this stage, Solomon's reputation remained unchanged. He was still recognized as wise, still respected, still in control. But the conditions that supported that reputation were no longer identical to the ones that had created it. And this is where the story begins to move toward its most critical phase. Not because something sudden happened, but because the accumulation of changes was approaching a point where it could no longer remain hidden. By this point in the reign of Solomon, the shift that had been building quietly was no longer just a background process. It had begun to shape visible outcomes, not in a way that immediately threatened the kingdom, but in a way that revealed a difference between what had once defined his leadership and what now influenced it. The earlier phase of Solomon's rule had been marked by clarity. His decisions were direct, grounded, and consistent, with the purpose he had chosen when he first asked for wisdom. But over time, that clarity had been diluted by competing influences. The alliances he had formed, the relationships he maintained, and the environment he operated within had introduced multiple perspectives into his decision-making process. One of the most significant consequences of this change was a gradual shift in priorities. The focus was no longer solely on maintaining the internal strength of the kingdom. External relationships, expansion, and the management of influence had become equally important. While these areas were not inherently negative, they required balance. Without that balance, they could begin to redirect attention away from the foundation that had made the system stable in the first place. At the same time, Solomon's personal environment continued to reflect the accumulation of his decisions. The relationships that had been formed for strategic reasons now had a more direct presence in his life. With that presence came expectations, subtle at first but consistent. These expectations did not demand immediate change. Instead, they encouraged adjustment over time. Adjustment, when repeated, becomes normalization. Practices that once existed outside the core of the kingdom began to appear within it, not as a replacement for what was already there, but as an addition. And additions, when not evaluated carefully, can alter the structure they are added to. This is where the difference between knowledge and discipline becomes clear. Solomon still possessed the ability to understand complex situations. His capacity for reasoning had not disappeared, but understanding does not automatically lead to correct action. It requires consistent application, especially when conditions are favorable and there is no immediate pressure to act carefully. As these changes continued, the environment around Solomon became increasingly layered. Decisions were no longer made within a single framework. They were influenced by multiple considerations: political, relational, and practical. Each of these had its own logic, and balancing them required more than just insight. It required restraint. Restraint becomes more difficult when there are no immediate consequences. This is a key point. Earlier in Solomon's reign, decisions carried visible outcomes. A wrong judgment would lead to conflict. A poor decision would weaken trust. The feedback was immediate and it reinforced the need for careful thinking. Now, the feedback was delayed. Decisions that introduced small deviations did not produce immediate problems. As a result, there was less pressure to correct them. Over time, this delay allowed patterns to develop. Choices that might have been reconsidered earlier were now repeated, not because they were clearly right, but because they did not appear to be wrong. This is how gradual change becomes established, through repetition in the absence of immediate consequence. The kingdom itself still functioned effectively. From an external perspective, it remained strong. Trade continued, resources were stable, and there were no major disruptions. But internally, the alignment between the original foundation and the current direction was no longer exact. This misalignment did not create immediate instability, but it reduced the system's ability to absorb future pressure. A system built on a clear foundation can adapt to challenges more effectively than one that has gradually shifted away from that foundation. At the same time, Solomon's identity as a wise ruler remained intact. People still respected his decisions, and his earlier reputation continued to influence how he was perceived. But reputation is based on past performance. It does not always reflect current conditions. This difference between perception and reality is important. It creates a gap, a space where changes can continue without being immediately recognized. And within that gap, the impact of those changes can grow. By now, the factors that would lead to Solomon's most significant mistake were fully in place, not as a single event waiting to happen, but as a system that had gradually moved away from its original structure. The decisions that would follow were not isolated. They were the result of everything that had been building over time. And when the outcome finally became visible, it would not appear as a sudden failure. It would appear as the natural result of a direction that had been changing. Slowly and consistently, the turning point in the life of Solomon did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a visible collapse. It emerged in a quieter way, through decisions that, on their own, did not seem extreme, but together created a direction that could no longer be ignored. By this stage, the influences around him were no longer just present. They had become integrated into how he lived and ruled. The relationships he had formed over time, many of them established for political stability, had brought with them different systems of belief and practice. These were not abstract ideas. They were expressed in rituals, traditions, and expectations that existed alongside the structure Solomon had originally built. Allowing space for these practices may have seemed like a practical decision at first, a way to maintain harmony and avoid conflict within a diverse environment. But over time, that allowance turned into acceptance. Acceptance, when repeated, becomes endorsement. This was the point where the shift became visible, not in a single action, but in a pattern. The environment around Solomon no longer reflected a single, consistent foundation. It had become a combination of influences, some of which were not aligned with the principles that had guided his earlier decisions. What makes this stage significant is not just the presence of these changes, but the absence of resistance to them. Earlier in his reign, Solomon had demonstrated the ability to recognize and respond to complex situations with clarity. But now, that same level of scrutiny was not being applied. The decisions being made were not necessarily uninformed, they were simply less restrained. This is where the nature of wisdom becomes critical. Wisdom provides the ability to understand, but it does not enforce action. It does not prevent a person from choosing a path that diverges from what they know to be right. In fact, it can sometimes make that divergence more subtle, because the individual is capable of justifying their choices. For Solomon, the environment had reached a point where justification became easier than evaluation. Each decision could be explained in terms of stability, relationship, or practicality. None of them appeared to threaten the kingdom immediately. And because there was no immediate threat, there was no urgent reason to change course. However, the cumulative effect of these decisions began to alter the internal structure of the kingdom. The clarity that had once defined leadership was replaced by a more flexible, but less consistent, approach. This did not create chaos, it created variation. And variation, when it extends beyond a certain point, begins to weaken the coherence of a system. At the same time, the external appearance of the kingdom remained strong. Wealth, influence, and recognition were still present. Visitors still arrived, trade continued, and the infrastructure remained intact. From a distance, nothing suggested that anything had gone wrong. But internal conditions do not always match external perception. The alignment between what the kingdom appeared to be and what it was becoming had started to diverge. This divergence is often difficult to detect in real time because it does not produce immediate disruption. It develops quietly, becoming noticeable only when its effects accumulate. For Solomon, this meant that the most significant change in his reign was not a loss of ability, but a shift in application. The wisdom he had once used to establish stability was no longer being applied with the same consistency. It was still present, but it was no longer the sole guide. And that difference, between having wisdom and consistently applying it, became the defining factor of this stage. The consequences of this shift were not immediate, but they were inevitable. A system that moves away from its foundation does not remain unchanged. It continues to function for a time, but its capacity to remain stable under pressure decreases. By now, the direction was set, not through a single mistake, but through a series of decisions that had gradually reshaped the environment. The outcome was no longer a possibility, it was a progression. And that progression would soon reach a point where its effects could no longer remain internal. Because when foundational alignment is lost, the impact does not stay hidden forever. By the time the effects of these changes became visible, the reign of Solomon had already moved far from the conditions that defined its beginning. The kingdom still stood, the structures were still in place, and from a distance, much of what had been built appeared intact. But internally, the alignment that once held everything together had weakened. The earlier strength of the kingdom had not come from its wealth or its alliances. It had come from consistency, from decisions that followed a clear foundation. That foundation had guided how problems were solved, how disputes were handled, and how direction was maintained. But now, that consistency had been replaced by variation. Decisions were no longer anchored in a single reference point. They were influenced by multiple factors, each with its own logic. This shift began to affect the broader system. When leadership loses consistency, it becomes more difficult for others to align with it. Those responsible for carrying out decisions, officials, administrators, and leaders within the kingdom, begin to interpret direction differently. Without a clear standard, variation spreads through the system. At first, this does not create immediate disruption. The structure is still strong enough to function. Processes continue and outcomes appear stable. But over time, the lack of alignment reduces the system's ability to respond effectively to pressure. Small issues that would have been resolved quickly in the past begin to take longer. Decisions require more adjustment, more correction, and more effort to maintain balance. This is how internal weakening begins, not through collapse, but through reduced efficiency and clarity. At the same time, the external perception of Solomon remained largely unchanged. His earlier reputation continued to influence how he was seen. People still recognized him as wise, and the legacy of his past decisions carried weight. But perception, once established, does not automatically update with changing conditions. This created a gap between reputation and reality. Within that gap, the consequences of earlier decisions continued to develop. The influences that had been allowed to integrate into the kingdom were no longer isolated. They had become part of its structure, and as they expanded, they introduced differences that could not be fully controlled. The most significant impact of this stage was not immediate destruction, but fragmentation. The unity that had once defined the kingdom began to weaken. Not in a way that was obvious at first, but in a way that made long-term stability more difficult to sustain. It is important to understand that none of this happened suddenly. There was no single moment where everything changed. Instead, the outcome was the result of a process, one that had been unfolding over time. Each decision, each adjustment, each shift in priority contributed to a direction that was now becoming visible. For Solomon, this represented the consequence of a pattern, not a single error. His wisdom had not disappeared. His ability to understand had not been lost, but the consistency with which that ability was applied had changed. And that change, over time, had altered the foundation of everything he had built. The result was a kingdom that still functioned, but no longer with the same level of internal strength. It was stable, but less resilient, organized but less aligned, successful but more vulnerable to future disruption. And this is the part of the story that is often overlooked. Not because it is less important, but because it does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, until the effects can no longer be separated from the system itself. The story of Solomon does not end with a dramatic fall or a single moment of failure. It ends with a realization, one that becomes clear only when the entire progression is considered from beginning to end. He began as a young king who understood his limitations. Faced with a responsibility he was not fully prepared for, he made a decision that defined his early success. He chose wisdom over immediate gain, and that choice allowed him to establish stability, resolve complex problems, and build a kingdom that functioned effectively. His wisdom was not theoretical. It was applied in real situations, producing outcomes that strengthened trust and reinforced his leadership. The judgment between the two women became a symbol of this ability, demonstrating that understanding human nature could reveal truth even when evidence was absent. As his reputation grew, so did his influence. The kingdom expanded, relationships developed, and prosperity increased. For a time, everything aligned. His decisions, his environment, and his responsibilities all supported the same direction. But over time, that alignment changed. The introduction of new influences, the expansion of responsibilities, and the gradual shift in priorities created a more complex environment. Within that environment, maintaining the same level of clarity required consistent effort. Without that effort, variation began to appear. This variation did not immediately disrupt the system. It developed slowly, allowing the kingdom to continue functioning while its foundation shifted. By the time the effects became visible, they were no longer tied to a single decision. They were the result of a pattern. The most important lesson in this story is not that Solomon lacked wisdom. It is that wisdom by itself is not enough. It must be applied consistently, especially when conditions are stable and there is no immediate pressure to do so. Solomon's mistake was not a single action. It was a gradual movement away from the foundation that had defined his success. Each step in that direction was small, often justifiable, and not immediately harmful. But together, they created a change that could not be reversed easily. This is what makes his story significant. It shows that the greatest risks are not always found in obvious mistakes. They are often found in subtle shifts, changes that seem minor at the time but accumulate into something larger. Solomon remains known as one of the wisest figures in history. That part of his legacy is not in question. But his story also demonstrates something else, that intelligence and understanding do not eliminate the need for discipline and consistency. In the end, the impact of his life is not defined by a single moment, but by the contrast between how he began and how his direction changed over time. And that contrast is what gives the story its lasting relevance, because it reflects a pattern that extends beyond a single individual. A pattern where clarity leads to success. Success leads to complexity. And complexity, without consistent discipline, leads to change.